Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sabrina Maddow, columnist with the National Post and Postmedia, and I'm very excited to be hosting Ontario at the Crossroads. This debate is presented by Postmedia and the National Post. Today we have two excellent panelists with us with lots of opinions, and they've known each other for a long time, so this is going to be a very good discussion. We have Tasha Kheiriddin, who is a principal with Navigator Limited and also a national political columnist with the National Post. And we have John Moore, who is a morning show host with News Talk 1010. Today, we're going to be talking about the future of Ontario, inspired by the province's license plate's new slogan, "A place to grow." Our central topic of debate will be whether that's still true, or whether the province has stagnated or worse, fallen into a period of decline. So we'll start with opening statements from each of our panelists. They'll each have an uninterrupted 2 minutes for that opening, which will be followed by a moderated discussion where we'll cover some of the biggest issues facing growth in Ontario as we head into next week's election, which is exactly 1 week from today on Thursday, June 2nd. So let's begin with our big question. Is Ontario still a place to grow? Let's start with John.
Thank you very much, and it's nice to see you both, and it's certainly nice to see my old friend Tasha Kheiriddin, and you're right, we've had this sort of Oxfordian debate school relationship for a good long time. I hope that people won't be terribly disappointed if we don't fight, because Tasha and I are famous for disagreeing about things because we have a different vision quite often of our country, our province, our city, but we don't tend to do a Punch and Judy show. And for me, as people will know if they listen to my show on News Talk 1010, I talk policy. I don't talk about necessarily a political party or a political leader. So I'm not here to shill for any one or the other. I'm actually quite convinced that Ontario is still a place to grow. If anything distresses me about the province of Ontario and the government of Ontario, it's the fact that I can't really see any light between Doug Ford's Conservatives and Kathleen Wynne's Liberals. So when it comes to, for example, trying to balance the budget or come up with some sort of fiscal probity, I just don't see it happening. And I know that Tasha and I, over the next hour, will be taking a look at some of the things that have happened in the first 4 years and some of the things that are being promised for the next 4 years, but I remain unconvinced that we're changing course. However, I also remain very optimistic about my province as a good place to do business and live.
Okay, John, you're optimistic. Tasha, what say you?
Well, I promise not to punch you, John, in reference to the Punch and Judy. It's absolutely great to be here. Thank you to the National Post and Postmedia for hosting this. And yes, I think we will agree on many things, but we will also disagree. And I think the first, point of disagreement, just to take you up, is that there's no light between the Liberals and the Progressive Conservatives. I think there is. I think there's a definite light in terms of vision. There are specific disagreements on things like the 413. There's disagreements also on things like rent control. There's disagreements. Those policies point to a larger ambit of the government's role in people's lives. So the question is whether you think growth lies through government or whether it lies more through the private sector. And that's where I think the decision lies here. To me, Ontario will continue to be a place to grow if the government continues, or I guess steps back a bit in terms of its intervention, but does move forward with certain projects, the Ring of Fire, for example, which I think is very important and something that the Ford government's been championing. What I also find interesting here is to see how the dynamic has shifted in terms of workers and and unions and representation of workers and their relationship to the government. And we know traditionally that labor unions have been supportive of the NDP and the Liberals, and now we've seen private sector unions come on board with the Conservatives. So this shift again is sort of like, where's the growth going to come from? Is it going to come from increased spending? Is it going to come from more spending, for example, on education? Is it building new schools, as the Tories want to do, or is it hiring more teachers like the Liberals want to do? On education, I probably actually side more, ironically, with the Liberals. John, you'll be happy to know. Maybe we agree there. I think smaller class sizes are a way to grow because they will increase the ability of kids to get a good education. So it's kind of a mixed bag. I think we're going to discuss over the next hour how these different aspects will play out in terms of sectors like family and business and other things that need to grow in this province. So I guess let's get started, Sabrina.
Yes, let's. Well, first, let's talk about the growth of Ontario's communities and if they are still on the track to growth. One of the biggest issues facing Ontario's communities is housing. As we all know, housing prices have skyrocketed over the pandemic, and many say we're now in a housing crisis. So how is this going to affect the future of Ontario's communities, both urban and rural? John, what do you think?
Well, one of the big issues here is that it's not really a provincial jurisdiction. And I know in the most recent federal budget, they also said, we're going to cut all the red tape so you can, rezone and build. And that's not your jurisdiction. You guys are in the wrong field. This is about cities. And so I know that a lot of people might argue, for example, that the construction of the 413, which Tasha brought up, would lead to more housing, but it's not the kind of housing that Ontarians are looking for. I don't think they're looking for these mega mansions that you find in that neck of the woods. And we can talk in more detail about whether the 413 is a good idea to begin with. What we really need to do is to figure out a way to have mixed use housing and multiplex housing, the way they do in Montreal, where they have sixplexes, but that reaches back more than 100 years. I just don't see that necessarily as a provincial jurisdiction. So I'm not necessarily convinced that this is something that is at stake in the provincial election, even though it is one of the most important issues in the province.
Tasha, what I'm hearing from John is that we have a missing middle in Ontario, but that the province might not be able to do that much about it. What do you think? Do you agree?
Well, I'm from Montreal too, and I know the missing middle there. I've always been mystified why it doesn't exist here in Toronto, but there's historical reasons for it. There was a desire, in fact, to build the single family home, and zoning for single family homes is what you see in the core of the city, which is what you don't see in Montreal, for example. You do have that different type of architecture of triplexes and sixplexes, and that does enable families who are, lower middle class, working class, to still get on the ownership ladder or to live closer to downtown in an affordable way. So I think that it is really important to look at that. The challenge, of course, is Nimbyism. John's right. It's not a provincial issue per se. It comes down to municipal zoning. And, if you paid $3 million for that single family home in Toronto, do you suddenly want your neighbor rezoned to build a triplex? You probably will not. And so you'll get opposition from local ratepayers. It becomes a political issue at that level. Would the province impose it? I mean, there's been some discussion of that at the federal conservative leadership in terms of the federal government imposing somehow by purse strings and pulling purse strings to have an impact on local zoning decisions. But I think that at the end of the day, it's going to come down to municipalities. And, building more homes, as the parties are proposing, is of course important. It's a question of where you build them, and people want to live closer to work. We're getting that sense in the pandemic. They also are moving out of a city and don't want to commute into it. So I think you will see growth. You'll see ex-urban growth of people who will be able to work from home. And I think that's where the 413 also comes in. I think that there is room for ex-urban growth. Not everyone's going to be driving the highways, but you still need them to get goods and services to those people when you build their homes.
John, do you think that we should be focused on more urban growth or ex-urban growth?
Well, this is where you get into issues of how Ontarians vote. And I think we should admit most of us are, most of the people who work for media outlets live in Toronto or Ottawa or a major urban center. So we're preoccupied by those issues. And there's also a dominance of seats in those areas as well. It's also an area in Toronto, at the very least, where the Conservatives don't do particularly well. I would say you always make a mistake when you try and plan for where people are going to live, because things change. And look at COVID. All of a sudden, everybody fled the downtown and went to other areas. And now that COVID is coming to an end, a lot of people are saying, I can't stand this commute. I've got to get back downtown. So I'm not sure what policies would nurture the construction of the housing we need. I still think this is a municipal issue. And I've been quite insistent on my own show in talking about the city of Toronto and what's wrong with our foot dragging and how we should just allow the construction of all kinds of new homes and multiplexes. But again, I come back to the same thing, and Tasha seems to agree. There's nothing Doug Ford or Steve Del Duca or Andrea Horwath can do about this.
What about taxes, whether they're for speculators or vacant homes? Is there anything the province can do there, Tasha?
Well, yeah, and that's been part of this election too, is discussing how to use those kinds of levers. And you also, foreign speculator tax is something that the federal government's frozen for 2 years, foreign ownership of property. So there's ways of getting around and using those kinds of levers. How effective will that be? I'm not sure exactly what the percentage of foreign speculation is in the city of Toronto or in other markets in Ontario. I know in BC, they found that foreign speculation actually increased prices by at least 5%. So you've got issues of that can be tackled. But I think the big issue too, and I want to raise this one because, apart from zoning, rent, is a very big piece of the puzzle as well. And you're looking at two parties that are proposing to bring back rent control. One's a province-wide rent control, as the NDP would like to do. Well, I think that is a mistake. If you're trying to incentivize building of new homes and building of the kind of housing John's talking about, which is also used frequently for rentals, you're not going to achieve that with rent control, especially if you peg rent at what the last tenant paid. I mean, how does that even incentivize you to improve your building? This is a very short-sighted approach, and it's kind of like the hammer you bring down. I think that would be a big mistake in terms of having Ontario as a place to grow, as we're discussing here.
I would agree, though, Sabrina, that if there are tax weapons or tools that a provincial government can use, the land transfer tax, for all the obsession in the city of Toronto over the cost of land transfer tax, if you've sold a house recently, you will notice that the province takes exactly the same share in land transfer tax. And I would advocate actually increasing that because it puts the brakes on people who are just flipping properties. Also, foreign ownership, I think, is a major factor. And I'm aware of apartment complexes, condo complexes, I should say, in Toronto, where people would arrive on date of purchase and buy up 10 units and they remain unoccupied. So those are units that were bought you were buying shares in Microsoft and they are not being used as houses. And that's the problem. You have to make sure that real estate and that places where people can live is about people actually living in them rather than just another commodity.
Yeah, but a lot of those houses that you're talking about, John, a lot of those single tiny apartments are also not necessarily where people want to live, which goes back to the missing middle zoning. They're built for professionals or for students or people who really need very little space, but they don't necessarily want to stay there forever. And they're also often being, as you pointed out, held and rented out. Previously on Airbnb before the pandemic, that was a big thing, and it still is to an extent now, but as things open up. But I think that really, if you want to create more housing, you have to look at what incentivizes the building of housing. And that is, like I said, not rent control. It is making sure that people can get the goods and services where they need. So when houses are built, that they have an incentive to live there. And I don't think they should all be living in the core. People do want space. We saw that in the pandemic. They want to have a lifestyle that's maybe more conducive to, a better quality of life as opposed to living in a little shoebox in the city.
Now, John, Tasha mentioned renters, which I'm a renter, and renters always seem to be left out of the conversation in favor of buyers. She said rent control is a short-sighted solution. Do you agree with that?
I tend to favor rent control. I realize that over the years, I mean, the one case study that everyone will keep coming back to is New York City, and rent control and where it became unworkable paralleled the evolution of New York City when it was actually down on its knees. So I think it's misrepresented. I do believe that you've got to create a stable rental market, much like you have to have a stable earning market where people have to have a degree of confidence they're going to have a job in 6 months and that they're going to be making a certain amount of money so they can make their plans. Ditto with renting. I think the average person wants to spend probably 5-10 years in the same location, and they need to know that it's not going to be out of control. They're not going to be evicted from the place with aggressive rent increases. I also think there are means of administering it where it's not like you're living in some, Soho apartment for $50 a month because you moved in there with, Bukowski in 1955. There are means of running rent control and making it work without it becoming a broken down system.
Tasha, does that change your mind at all?
No, John, I'm having visions of Bukowski in the 50s now sitting there. Reading in his shirt sleeves, his I hate to use the word wife beater, that is such an arcane term, but his undershirt sitting there. Anyway, I think that especially now in a time of really increasing inflation, the pressure that rent control would put on landlords would be tremendous. People complain about the state of rental housing in the city. The city itself, also, frankly, I mean, it's public housing, and some parts of it is a disgrace. It is not kept up at all. And if you're going to add rent control into the mix for private housing, you're going to discourage the upkeep of buildings. You're going to see things fall into disrepair. And so then you get this vicious cycle of people, living in conditions they don't want to live in, but then they don't necessarily want to move. And so because, I have low rent. So how does that help anyone? I think really we have to look at the market as it is now and say we need to build more homes. We need to build the kind of things people want to rent, and they need to be kept in good repair. And so no, rent control, extending it to the whole province, I think would be a huge mistake.
But I disagree with the premise whenever people say that something is inhibiting people from doing business. I still see having rental apartments as a very profitable thing. And holding somebody, for example, to the line of inflation in terms of their annual increase in rent is not going to break them apart. So I always think this idea that it's sort of, the idea that if taxes are too high, people are going to move. Well, if that was true, then everybody would live in Nassau.
Well, interest rates are going up. So talk to landlords. I think that, they're going to be facing mortgage renewals and the like. That's going to put pressure on them too. Is that going to be accounted for if all you account for is inflation and rent control? Absolutely not. So costs will matter. And then, like I said, then repairs don't get done and things don't get built.
I want to move to another major issue affecting growth in small towns. One of the top issues in rural Ontario is skyrocketing gas prices. How will this affect growth, especially in more suburban rural areas? And is there anything any of the candidates or provincial leaders can do about it? John?
This is a toughie, and I don't know how you would necessarily do means testing to figure out how much does somebody actually need their vehicle. And I get it, if you live in a rural area and if you are a commercial driver in particular, you're going to be consuming fuel and you have no choice. And the price of gas goes up. And we talk about in economics the elasticity of demand, but the fact of the matter is most people just swallow it. So when the price of gas goes up, they use the exact same amount of gas. They just end up paying the money and taking it out of another budget envelope. But if you're a downtown jerk like me with your car, then you have the ability to change your lifestyle. You have a horizon where you can get into an electric car. You have the ability to figure out how to carpool, whatever it might be. So if there were a means of coming up with a way of identifying those who need help, and I still think it should only be temporary. I know it's often seen, and Tasha, you and I can talk about this, as very snobby. The idea, well, how dare you tell rural people how to live? But the fact of the matter is that the price of gas is a global phenomenon. And when it goes up, as it did, for example, in the 1970s, ultimately people change their behavior. And nobody likes to change their behavior. But the idea we can continue on this level of unsustainability where like half of the vehicles in North America are pickup trucks, and yet about 10% of those are commercial, that just doesn't work anymore.
Well, it's great the Liberals want to, give you a subsidy on electric cars to a certain ceiling. I know you can buy for $65,000. You probably can buy a very nice electric car, but the point is that's not going to help anyone who lives out off the grid or outside of the major grids in the major cities, anyone who lives in rural communities. And the problem is you're seeing
they still have plugs in rural communities.
Yeah, okay. Unless you're going to start building charging stations everywhere. Do you know how much hydro is in rural communities, John? It is much higher than you're paying. Trust me.
Oh, so I know, and believe me, we can dig into that one because that's all three parties.
Yeah, well, let me go on the gas price first, and then we can tackle electricity. But the point is, gas prices do affect, yes, of course, people will adapt their behavior, but they affect much more than simply a commercial driver. You've got people who commute long distances to work, pipe fitters, roofers, anyone in construction in a rural area. They're driving to their job site, and they're not a commercial driver. They're the person who's doing the work. And it's expensive. It is getting very expensive. And it's not just the gas price. Of course, the tax on top of that, every time the price goes up, the government gets a bigger chunk, which is why the Tories are saying, hey, we're going to cut the gas tax. It's something that I think makes a lot of sense at the present time. I think also that when you're looking at gas in terms of what it does for the cost of living generally, transporting goods out to those places, transporting goods to your local grocery store out in Baycroft, for example, it's going to cost you a lot more than the stuff that comes into Toronto in the big tractor trailer and boom, there it is. And it's a much shorter distance from the central depot to the grocery store than it is to take it all the way to other communities. So those are the kinds of things that people don't realize. Gas prices impact everything in rural communities, and people there have generally a lower income to start with. So I think it is a very serious issue. It's not something urbanites have it much easier because we have options. But in rural communities, you really don't.
Right. I guess one of my issues, though, is that I would hate for gasoline to become the next electricity if we want to fold these two in together. In Ontario, electricity was too expensive. People couldn't stomach it because the government was responsible for electricity. Everybody blamed the government. So what do? We subsidize the cost of electricity by using tax dollars. So everybody collectively as taxpayers is running down your bill. That doesn't mean you're not paying for it. So I would hate for us to start using the same strategy which is unsustainable, and actually it's a negative drag on the provincial purse, in creating a means of making gasoline cheaper, rather than over time trying to figure out, okay, if gasoline is no longer something that is sustainable for the economy, where do we go now?
Yeah, but the government's already done their budgeting for the year, and they were budgeting at a time when gas prices were not quite as high as they are now. So they know how much they need to take in gas taxes. It's easy for them to lower the percentage they take to get to the same revenue stream that they had predicted. They can do that. They don't need to gouge and get a windfall simply because the price of gas is going up. So I think that argument fails there. And in terms of electricity, yeah, well, whose fault is that? The government for years under the Liberals bought electricity, paid producers very high prices for green energy that were unsustainable over the long term. And we've seen also, they built out the grid following, of course, the issues we had, the blackouts or brownouts or whatever you want to call it, and the big one in particular in the early 2000s. That costs a lot of money as well. And for rural consumers, this is one of the big issues too. The grid was also expanded or strengthened to carry the weight of all those green producers out there who were incentivized to, put solar collectors in their fields everywhere and do this kind of thing, and the grid couldn't handle it. So you've seen an extreme increase in the price of electricity due to mismanagement for years, and the people are going to pay the price for it now, I think, is just wrong. You can't expect people to plug their electric car in if they're in a rural community. Also, the distances are longer. This is the other thing. Until the technology catches up, you're not going to be able to use those vehicles in places where you have to drive hundreds of kilometers a day.
Okay, well, I mean, I don't want to litigate electric vehicles, and I'm not trying to be all Elon Musk.
The death of the electric car, John.
But I mean, the average electric vehicle has 400 to 500 kilometers on a charge. So very, very few people actually cover that in a single day. But I think it's also important, and I don't want to litigate the entire history of Ontario's hydro, but the problem is the Conservatives let it go. The NDP monkeyed around with it for a few years, and then the Liberals came in and said, well, we've got to bring this into a state of repair, which is kind of like when you turn around and say, we've got to redo the roof of the house that we haven't done in 20 years. There's a huge amount of sunk cost. The green energy thing was a failed project, although in the long term, it might have actually led to something, but it was a failed project. It was a very economically supportable one. The idea that if you overpay for a certain form of electricity, a whole bunch of people are going to get into the business of supplying that electricity, and over time it gets cheaper. But we don't have to go back to that because it's dead. I still would say that all three parties have played a role, and we are in this crazy situation where we collectively are paying for the price of electricity and pretending that we're not.
Well, John, I want to redirect you to a related topic, which is transit. We've had Stephen Del Duca come out prominently with his promise of buck-a-ride transit across the province. Is this a real solution for connecting people, or just a catchy campaign slogan?
Well, it is a catchy campaign slogan, and we had buck a beer, now we have buck a ride. And I think that coming out of COVID, it might be a means, and especially dealing with the inflation and the price of energy that Tasha and I have been talking about, it might be a good short-term idea in order to shape some new habits. But I also think that it's largely a gimmick. And let it not be forgotten that we're back to issues that address urban voters who the Liberals want to chase after, who they already have a preference, for. And the NDP and the Liberals are going to fight over Toronto. I don't know that too many Conservatives, if any, are going to win seats. So promising everybody cheap transit is a great idea. But I often cite this problem for me anyway. I do okay. I don't need somebody to subsidize my transit. I probably don't even need somebody to subsidize my electricity, but I get these benefits, and we come up with these amazing ideas of cheaper programs and tax cuts. And I always say that's just money for me and my sushi.
Well, you know what, John, from transit to sushi to beer, I'm getting hungry here. Okay, let's unpack this. I think that the Liberals are trying to be catchy with this, and you're absolutely right. They and the NDP are fighting over the urban vote in this election. And look at the polls. They're so close right now. They're splitting it. It's going to be really interesting. That could actually perhaps get the Tories some seats in places where they haven't had them before. But I think that the emphasis on transit is kind of misplaced because, yes, gas prices go up. People will take it anyway, right? It becomes an option where all of a sudden time and money equation makes sense. Like, okay, I'm going to leave the car at home and I'm going to take transit. I don't need to be incentivize with $1 a ride to take transit. And talk about subsidized. Transit systems around the world are subsidized. I think there's not a single one that is completely user pay, but still, that doesn't mean that you should suddenly drop the floor of revenue to $1, especially when the TTC we know has had all sorts of budgeting issues, overspending issues. It's also needing a lot of repair and maintenance that's not getting done. So all of a sudden, cutting the revenue stream doesn't make sense to me. I think that it is just done because, like you said, it sounds good. And as rural voters or suburban voters are going to look at this and just roll their eyes and say, well, It's not an option for me anyway, so it doesn't really mean anything out here.
Just as a placeholder, though, for anybody who wants to debate transit and the subsidy of transit, Toronto actually has the highest percentage of what the riders pay versus the service provided.
I knew you'd bring that up.
I know. Torontonians pay 75% of the cost of using public transit. New Yorkers pay about 50%. And I've got a colleague who's a bit of a tea partier who's always saying, why don't you pay 100%? To which I always say, have you any idea how much the taxpayers subsidize highways, roadways, how much they subsidize the infrastructure for cars? So, let's not get upset if we subsidize public transit.
The type of transit we seem to be hearing about most during this campaign, though, has been highways. And we have an audience question here I'm going to pose to you both. Instead of spending billions on the Highway 413, why not use the money to buy back the 407 or expropriate it and have the underused highway take the burden off the 401, especially if it were mandated that trucks had to use it?
I don't think it would buy the 407, and I don't think that the owners of the 407 are going to take lightly. Expropriation would send an absolutely terrible signal, and that's not going to happen. There'd be a lawsuit in 5 minutes. I think also, lowering the tolls on the 407. Well, the 413 has been debated, discussed. It's got its opponents and it's got its supporters, and it's going to shave off, according to the government anyway, 30 minutes, which is not insignificant in terms of transit. So I think that, or transit times. So I think that, for drivers, it does make sense. It also opens up communities. And like I said earlier, people are making different choices in terms of where they live and work. And people are choosing, and employers are also acquiescing to more work from home. So living further from the city becomes an option. It doesn't mean you're going to be taking that highway every day. Like I said, it will be there to service the communities that build up around it. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, when it comes to the 413, though, I resent the way the debate has been framed, because if you say that this is a bad idea because the research says that it's a bad idea, then you hate cars, you hate people who don't live in the city core, you're some sort of a NIMBY environmentalist, bicycle riding, Gewürztraminer drinking jerk. And frankly, I just look at the 413, and it's quite clever when Doug Ford accuses Steve Del Duca of having flip-flopped on it. That's not actually what happened. The Liberals decided, based on advice, they would build the 413. Then they sent that out for research. The research came back and said it's not worth the money. And it's not worth the environmental sacrifice. I mean, this is not about just because we like beavers. It's because it really is going to cut a major swath through some greenland and some farmland, as a matter of fact, in Ontario. So the 413, according to the people who studied it, was a bad idea. So the Liberals decided to end it. And like many things, when Doug Ford came to power, he decided that anything that the Liberals were doing was a bad idea, and anything they weren't doing might be a good idea. So we're back to the 413. But when I look at it, I'm never a big believer in new construction. And Tasha, you're absolutely right that when it comes to the 407, we actually leased it. So it would be very, very fraught. But we could come up with ideas. People have suggested, for example, that commercial vehicles could use the 407 for free or for less, that we might subsidize that. The problem with the 407 is it's way underutilized. So we built this highway, we leased it, they gouge us all the time, and we're not getting full value for it. So what are we going to do? Spend $10 billion building an alternative to it.
I will say one of the nice things about the 407, actually, it's not full of commercial trucks. It's actually a safer highway. As somebody who does take it, I think that it would be great if it were more used. I totally agree. But I think, again, it's a question of communities that are being built out there along the highway. It actually has opened up huge areas. I mean, think of Whitby, for example, the north of Whitby, Brooklyn, a community that's benefited incredibly from the 407, and now it goes all the way out to the 115. So you're going to get growth along the 407. More people are going to use it. And I think, again, like you said, it would be such a debacle to try and change the relationship, the commercial relationship on that highway. We ended up paying for that instead of actually building a new highway, the 413.
And without getting myself into legal trouble, I will note that I think there is some merit to what the NDP and the Liberals say about what an incredible, enriching project this is going to be for an awful lot of people who seem to already be friends with Doug Ford. I think I lawyered myself carefully.
Ooh, well, before we get John into legal trouble, let's move the conversation to Ontario as a place to grow a family. One of the biggest topics has been childcare, access to it, its cost. There's been a lot of talk about $10 a day childcare. Is this something that's realistic? Tasha, can $10 a day childcare happen on a broad scale? And if so, how?
You know, it's funny, you're already seeing, I think, some Montessori schools saying it's going to put them out of business if suddenly there's $10 a day childcare, because they're going to have to charge more to give the quality of education they give. I have really mixed feelings about childcare. I think that, yes, for people who need childcare, people who absolutely have no choice but to put their children in childcare to work, then we should make every effort to make it available. At the same time, I think that there are people, and this is the experience in Quebec where I'm from and I keep tabs on regularly, people in higher income brackets who use childcare as a bit of a drop-off center, who benefit from it when they don't really necessarily need to have it that cheap. And the government there changed it to be a bit of a sliding scale, but still not significant enough, in my opinion. I think that here, Doug Ford, you know, he saw what was on offer. I mean, the federal government is very, very big on their childcare deal. The real question is the quality that you get. And at $10 a day, what quality will you get as a parent? How much will it be subsidized? How good will it be? I think really it goes down to choice. And most parents would like to have a choice of what type of childcare. If you just do this straight incentivizing big box childcare, that is not in the interest of children, I will say. And I don't think it's in the interest of families either. There are so many different models of childcare, and that's really where it comes down to, is that it has to be what fits the individual child and what fits the family. So if you move in that direction, it can be a positive thing. But if you just incentivize a one size fits all, definitely not.
This is where I have to say I have admiration for Doug Ford. And I think we've dealt with two different Doug Fords in the last 4 years. The first 2 years were about settling petty scores, like cutting Toronto City Council in half and the license plate debacle and all kinds of things like that. And then Doug Ford, I think, became a very pragmatic politician. So if Ottawa's on offer, here's some money, create childcare, then instead of having that reflexive conservative instinct of saying, no, absolutely, the state's job is not in child. He said, okay, how much money? Let's do this. I think it is to be proven whether or not this actually works out in the long run. But Doug Ford actually got a good deal, right? Because he was offered a 5-year deal. He held out for 6 because the feds have a terrible habit of ponying up cash for a new program and then turning their backs on it and leaving it on the province. But when it comes to childcare, I am a believer in it. And I think, you know, the research is established in jurisdictions all over the world that it's good for the economy.
Well, good for the economy. Yes, it's good in the sense that, you know, yes, businesses want as many workers in the workforce as possible. And women too. As a working woman, I will say I wanted to go back to work too, but not full time initially. And this is the thing, again, childcare and flexibility is one of the keys, because it is something that impacts not just the economy, but children. And there have been studies too on the impact of early childcare. We're talking really early, like at the age of 1 year or less on children. It is not positive. So I think that, you know, incentivizing that kind of choice, I personally am not in favor of it. Incentivizing choices where, yes, or responding to choices where people actually have no choice but to go to work, then of course you don't want people to be dependent. This is again, it goes to dependency on the state, right? You want people to be able to exercise their choice to go to work, and if they need subsidized childcare at that age, then so be it. But I think the preference would be to not have that. And in Ontario, we already have junior kindergarten, age 4. So really childcare, what are we talking about? Ages 2 and 3. Those are the 2 years. Generally speaking, most people do not put their kids into childcare before they are a year old. But then they start looking at it when maternity leave ends or paternity leave.
Yeah, but I think we also have, mostly from personal experience, this impression that childcare is about some urban professional dropping their child off at 8 o'clock in the morning, picking them up at 4 in the afternoon. We forget that there are, for example, well,
I don't know where.
Listen, I worked in a nursery school. I hung out plenty of times after 6 o'clock waiting for the late parents. Right. But we're forgetting that there are models out there. There are people who, and we learned this during COVID, simply have no choice. There were people who went to work because they were sick, but they had no choice because they needed the money. There are daycares, and it breaks my heart to talk about it because it's not even daycare. There are night workers who drop their children off at industrial daycares, and the kids actually are tucked into bed and they sleep at that place at night. These are the models I think we need to be looking at, rather than thinking again about the person who's like, well, I could have stayed home for another year, but I decided that I wanted to get back to the law firm.
Right. Well, I don't think we disagree there. And this goes to exactly the bit of about choice and what's the best way to ensure that choice gets made. And that's where the government, with the way they spend the money, comes in. Because if they incentivize a certain type of childcare, then that's what's going to get built. And I think you're absolutely right. There's need for flexibility. Workers have different schedules, parents have different needs, and children have different needs too. And, large institutional childcare is not for every kid. Some kids really do need smaller, more home-like settings, and that to me should be an option. It shouldn't just be one size fits all.
I want to move to talking about what the future for growing businesses in Ontario looks like. And another major issue is raising the minimum wage. How much should it be raised? We have the PCs coming in at $15.50 in the fall. The other parties are around $16, and the NDP are proposing going up to $20 by 2026. Some small business owners obviously say this is unaffordable, but on the worker side, with inflation, they say they need it. Tasha, what's the solution here?
Well, it's interesting coming out of the pandemic, because so many of those jobs that were actually low-wage jobs, and thinking specifically in the service sector, the restaurant sector, people don't want to do them anymore. And there you were paid sometimes less because you were getting supplemented by tips. But people have been bailing from that sector in droves. So is the answer to that perhaps increasing the minimum wages? Will that make that kind of work more attractive? I don't know. I think there's a big shift going on in terms of people's priorities and where they want to spend their working days. So, to just arbitrarily, and I think, it's nice to arbitrarily say, we'll increase it to $20 by that time. We don't know what the future holds in terms of inflation. We don't know the impact that will have on the small business owner who suddenly has to pay higher wages to that level, and also is facing increased costs of supplies, of materials, and other things. So you're going to have a situation where potentially you will price out the entry-level worker. This is the problem with the minimum wage. It's this constant dance between incentivizing the hiring of people who generally have little experience. Maybe it's their first job, or maybe it's a part-time job. Maybe they're new even to Canada, period. They're not a student, but they're coming here and they don't have their skills recognized yet. How do you get jobs created for that workforce and still make sure that they get paid enough to live on? Yes, but not price them out, because the minute you start raising the wage, the expectation is the employee will come with more education or skill, and the employer will look for the best value. So people at the lower end get priced out of that first job.
I think this is a bit of an academic argument, though, because as Tasha was saying, we are in a certain magical phase, I guess, in the economy where minimum wage is meaningless. I mean, people are offering all kinds of incentives to get servers back into server jobs. And the reason they left them was actually because it was a very abusive field of work where you could wake up at 8 o'clock in the morning and be told, yeah, we don't need you for lunch today. You're not earning anything. It was frontline work. It was difficult work. And servers found other kinds of jobs over 2 years and said, I love this and I get benefits. But if you want to get back to the notion of the minimum wage, I don't know what the magic price will be when we get to less inflationary times, but it is worth noting Doug Ford, when he came to power, canceled an increase in the minimum wage that had been scheduled by the Liberals. And when the Liberals brought around their very first increase in the minimum wage, we had 14 months that followed. We had job growth in 13 of them. So that old argument that whenever you raise the minimum wage, people fire people and replace them with robots or figure out how to get by without them proved not to be true. The economy was just fine. So when we get back to a baseline where the economy becomes more predictable, then I would support the notion of actually pegging the minimum wage to inflation. And I think we should have done that a long time ago instead of leaving it stagnant and then all of a sudden saying, how could we possibly go another $2 an hour?
Well, that's an interesting place to put it, to have a graduated increase as opposed to the big chunks. But I know there's other studies, John, you want to get academic. In Seattle, they did a study where they raised the minimum wage there to $15, and smaller low-wage jobs did vanish. So there was a negative impact. So it's like I said, it's a dance between the two. I don't think any government is going to be able to scrap the minimum wage, as some academics would like to do. That's never going to happen. But at the same time, you have to figure out the sweet spot in terms of the marketplace to make sure that you're not negatively impacting the jobs that are on offer.
All right. The other wage conversation.
The Seattle study was highly flawed, but we can talk about that.
Sabrina, step in. We're gonna
I'll let you guys discuss that over cocktails later. The other wage increase issue we've been talking about is for public sector workers, especially nurses. Should their wage increases be limited? Tasha, what's your opinion?
Yeah, this is a tough one because we know that we need more nurses in this province. And they've been on the front lines now for 2 years in a pandemic where arguably, without our healthcare professionals, there would be fewer of us here. They've had probably the worst time, I think, of any workforce. So I think that when we talk about nurses, I think all the parties are looking at some way of increasing the supply of nurses. I think that increasing the pay, that's something that the Conservatives want to incentivize people with. I think at a time when it's been such a difficult job to do, I think is a good idea. I think that people will respond to an economic incentive, though job satisfaction and burnout is a huge issue. Addressing burnout is something that money may not do. So I think you have to figure out a way, whether it's also foreign nurses. I know Quebec went that way. They recognized credentials that hadn't been recognized before, to free up people to get into the field. All that kind of thing has to be looked at, I think, if we really want to make sure that we have enough nurses and make sure also that they're paid enough.
Yeah, I think the problem when it comes to the nursing question is that we pretend that all public employees are on the same plane, and that's not true. I think, for example, the teachers, a lot of my listeners think teachers are overpaid. I think teachers are fairly paid. It's a tough job. We should pay them well. But then you get into, just ordinary civil servants, police officers, all kinds of other people who work for the province. And we came up with this one-size-fits-all get tough policy of only 1% a year. And then inflation arrives and COVID arrives and nurses become our heroes where we're standing on balconies banging on pots. So I think nurses definitely deserve a raise. But that doesn't mean breaking open the whole model of holding people to a certain annual increase for the time being. Like I said, I think teachers are well paid. I think a few years at a certain percentage increase each year, even notwithstanding inflation, is not more than they can bear.
Tasha, you mentioned foreign workers, and whether it's in healthcare or the skilled trades or other industries, Ontario is really trying to attract foreign workers, skilled ones, but at the same time, we can't offer affordable housing, our schools are overburdened, our access to healthcare is limited. How do we offer immigrants a better deal to not just come here, but stay here?
Well, they will come. The question is integration. People will still come. People are still around the world with all the shifts now happening. And you're seeing, obviously the war in Ukraine is just the latest. Hopefully more dominoes will not fall in terms of that. It's provoked a huge refugee crisis and people are clamoring to leave. So you're getting that additional pressure in addition to the migration pressures from the rest of the world that were already there. People are going to come to Ontario. We're the biggest destination in Canada. And they come mostly to the GTA. So yeah, you're right, Sabrina, all the things you identified are a problem. Is also the problem of when you've got people coming here and maybe English isn't their first language, you have to integrate them. Are the supports here enough? Because, we've been talking a lot at the federal level. There's been a lot of discussion in the Conservative leadership race about recognizing credentials. And I think that's a very smart thing to do because people come here and they want to contribute to the economy. They want to be able to do things other than drive a cab. The stereotype is, right? And they can't necessarily do that quickly enough to establish themselves. So I think that more has to be done on that front, whether it's provincially or it's federally. I'm not sure where exactly these professional corporations are probably regulated at the provincial level, but there has to be something done to make sure that skills and talents are utilized because our immigration system is geared to that. It's geared to attracting skilled immigrants. And when you look at how well they do, it's interesting. The children of immigrants, and specifically of skilled immigrants, do better. They out-earn their Canadian-born counterparts. So obviously we're doing something right in the sense that people are coming and they're climbing the ladder of success, but we could still do a better job.
Yeah, at the risk of being the hard ass here, I would echo a few of the themes of what Tasha was just saying, which is for 150 years, people have been coming to Canada. It ain't easy. and it's a hard landing. But at the same time, you're landing in a country with an incredible education system, a successful economy. There are plenty of supports. You have access to some of the best medicine possible. So I want these people to feel welcome, Sabrina, and I want them to find success. But I'm not sure that there's too many things they're not getting. The average immigrant, we always have to hive this off. There's the immigrants, and then about 10% of the newcomers are refugees. That's something else altogether. But of the immigrants, they had to earn their way into the country in the first place. They have to come with some sort of a guarantee of employment and a means, and often, money in the back pocket. So I'm not actually convinced it's necessarily a place where we're lacking.
One thing we need to do, though, is speed up processing. That is totally fallen off a cliff during COVID. Ironically, when the time, we had fewer people coming here in the first place. But that is a federal responsibility, and that they've got to deal with that.
Yeah, I'm going to take us to another audience question at this point, and this is a big picture one. Governments of all political stripes have preferred to rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic rather than make hard choices to address the serious problems. How can we fix a government system that is broken and malfunctioning? Tasha.
Oh my God! Wow. Okay. Well, the Titanic analogy is often used. Trying to think what this listener is specifically referring to, because there's so many places to go. I think that governments, governments have a tendency, they work with, obviously, what the limits in which they can play. The limits have kind of changed. The pandemic, and even before the pandemic, deficits suddenly became acceptable. So spending has become a de facto solution for a lot of governments of all stripes, where it wouldn't have been before, because the public's antipathy to deficits and debt seemed to go down. And they felt more comfortable doing that. As a result, now you're seeing them kind of scrambling, especially post-COVID, when we've gotten so much debt, to figure out, how do we live within our means? What can we do? And I think that one of the things that they need to do is look at a way to bring in tax relief, which is one thing that does help fight inflation, leaves more money in your pocket, leaves you more money to be able to meet your obligations, or at least cope with inflation, if not fight it. How can they do that when they're still spending and proposing things? And, like dental care, for example, the NDP are all over that one, provincially as well as federally. And that's one of their promises, creating new programs. I think government has to sort of not rearrange the deck chairs, put some of them away. Like, take some of the chairs and just, no, we're not going to take out that chair this year because there is no money for it. And we think it's better to try and move to a situation where we have some fiscal room to give people a break.
Well, if we want to continue the metaphor of the Titanic, I refer to the movie, and the door is not big enough for two people to be on it. That's the real problem.
What about the lifeboat?
Yeah. And also, I'll pick a minor fight with you, Tasha, for a second, because actually increasing taxes is an inflation fighter. I'm not recommending that, but when you increase taxes, that reduces the velocity, and it can fight inflation. It's actually a more effective weapon than the central bank, but let's not get too deep into that.
Thank you, Pierre.
I have a problem, and I have had a problem with provincial finances for forever. The four budgets that Kathleen Wynne's government brought in, each of them suffered from something what I call "it would be nice" syndrome. It would be nice if we had all-day kindergarten. It would be nice if everybody got $50 to spend on, I don't know, a tree, whatever. There are so many programs that the Liberals were ready to spend money on. And then the Conservatives arrived, and it's even bigger. I mean, the most recent budget is $198 billion. It is adjusting for inflation and even taking into account the insanity of COVID. It is still fatter than the provincial Liberal budget. This is, and we were talking about this when we were preparing for this debate, Tasha, this is my problem. I don't see a significant difference. I don't want slash and burn Harris back, but I do want to see a government. I have this radical thing I wrote a column about for the National Post, which was, we have to collectively make up our minds. What is it we want from government? What are the services we want? Then how can we provide that effectively? And finally, how do we fairly tax people to pay for it? And instead, all we have is we want everything. And then we pretend that we're not actually paying for it.
Yeah, I think I don't think the progressive conservatives have been angels, rather, in terms of spending. I agree. They've taken the latitude people have given, which is, we don't expect the budget to be balanced. It's okay. And they've run with it. I think some spending yields greater benefits than others. For example, developing the Ring of Fire, the infrastructure necessary to do that is going to be very costly, but it's going to create a lot of high value jobs. It's going to push the critical minerals extraction to a point where we can actually help fight climate change and build the EVs that we were talking about earlier, or the batteries for the EVs, supply markets even outside of Canada. That is a good thing. So I'm in favor of some of this stuff and some of the spending that's on offer. But yeah, I'm definitely not in favor of all of it.
Before we have to wrap up, I want to talk about the future of political movements and how they're growing in Ontario. We've talked a lot about the Liberals, the Conservatives, we've even touched on the NDP, but what about the smaller parties and newer parties? The Greens aren't a new party, but they've been getting some positive attention this time around. We also have the New Blue, the Ontario Party coming on the scene. Is this going to shake up Ontario politics and the political landscape at all? John, thoughts?
I don't think so. I know that the narrative, it's the horse race, right, in the election. And we've reached this sort of stasis where it's almost like, could we just vote now? So for the next week, we've got to come up with another story. And that story is going to be, is Mike Schreiner and the Green Party, are they surging? Is this going to be the breakthrough? My prediction is that Mike Schreiner will continue to be the only MPP for his party. And I like Mike Schreiner an awful lot. So I always hate kind of talking him down. The Blues, I haven't done a lot of research on, to be perfectly honest, but I think people are pretty heavily invested in the brands. And I think the brands are very strong at the moment. You know what the NDP is, you know who the Liberals are or used to be. And Doug Ford has had a 4-year track record to establish what the Progressive Conservatives are. So I don't see a great appetite for people saying, let's try this.
I don't think it's never easy for a smaller party to break through. And the Greens right now, I think, are sitting at 6%, last poll I saw yesterday. So I don't see I agree. I don't think Mike's going to have a lot of company there in Queen's Park. But I will say this, 44% of people in that poll were undecided. That's a big number. I mean, that's more than the Tory support at 38%. So obviously the undecided vote, if people are not happy with the establishment parties, they could put their vote for one of the new parties. If they do that, the question is, who will it impact? And you've got the Ontario Party and the Blue Party. Those would definitely, I think, take votes away from the Tories. Could that have an impact in places where the Tories are relying on a split between the Liberals and the NDP to maybe come up the middle? Some of those more urban seats that could be in play? Well, yes, it could. It also could impact them in rural communities if suddenly that becomes a thing. If people start, as we see on the federal scene with the PPC, which definitely cost the federal Conservatives some seats because it split the vote just enough to allow one of the other parties to get in. So I think it's early days. I don't think it'll have a huge impact in this election necessarily, but maybe it's something to watch down the road.
Yeah, I guess we spend so much time following American politics where it's this binary process, Republican or Democrat. We already have 3 strong choices in the province of Ontario. I don't know what sort of an appetite there may be to move beyond that. And again, I feel guilty. He's probably not watching us right now, but Mike Schreiner, I don't get what the Greens are about. I don't understand why you can't choose your party. If it's about environmentalism, and I realize they're bigger than that, then you can go with the party you think has the best environmental plan. I've never, and even though they held the balance of power in BC, it was because they had 2 seats.
Yeah, all of Europe's been very pro-green, John. So obviously it's gotten traction somewhere. Yeah.
I want to squeeze in one more audience question before we go to our closing remarks, because this is a big one a lot of people have been talking about. Whatever happened to fiscal responsibility? No party is talking about it. The return to balance is years away, maybe, and Canadians are sinking in debt that's going to have to be paid for. What about cutting spending and cleaning up the balance sheet as promised?
Great
John?
idea. Oh.
Yeah, I'm in.
Tasha, you have very strong feelings. Please go ahead.
I was going to say, I think it's yes, I think that we have to get back to that space. I think that, we lost it federally after 2015. And I think that then domino affected to the rest of the country and various provincial governments. And of course, COVID blew it completely out of the water. It also helped that we had low interest rates and lots of people were carrying debt in their personal lives and still are. With things like HELOCs and large mortgages and other debt instruments. So they kind of got comfortable with it. And I think that in their minds, well, government has debt, but hey, I manage my debt. And how bad is it? Well, interest rates are going up now. Inflation is here now. People are suddenly buckling their belts. And I think there's more of a consciousness of the importance of being able to meet your obligations, maybe that will then trickle up to how they vote or what they demand of government.
I'm not entirely opposed to governments having deficits and debt, because it's a bit like, I mean, all of us probably, I know, Sabrina, you said you rent, but we have mortgages, and that's a reasonable thing to imagine. Okay, over 40 years, I'm going to pay this house off and then I will own it. But on paper, I'm in debt. However, I also think it's not terribly instructive to compare government finances to home finances. I got it when the Liberals under Kathleen Wynne made some pretty serious investments, particularly in electricity, and said, we'll pay this off over the years. But even setting aside COVID, we just keep on spending money and borrowing money to cover programs that don't make sense, that are lovely ideas, but don't make sense in the long term. So I'm totally with that viewer. You know, whatever happened, it sounds like a bad pop tune, whatever happened to fiscal probity?
Well, on that note, I think we're set for closing remarks with only a few minutes left. So let's return to our debate's big central question. Is Ontario still a place to grow? Tasha, why don't you kick this off?
Sure. I think, well, we've explored all of the pros and cons of things that could impact growth positively or negatively. And just to pick up the last point, I think that is one of the big ones, is if we keep growing our debt, if we don't get finances under control and we keep spending, will we be a place to grow? Because at the end of the day, that money's going to come from somewhere, and it's going to come from the taxpayer. And that, we know, curbs growth. If there was any lesson from the Mike Harris years, it is that you've got to rein in spending, lower taxes, and the growth will come. So we're nowhere near that yet. I'm optimistic we can get there, and some of the parties have proposed, a couple of parties have proposed, the Liberals, business tax cuts, the Conservatives gas tax cuts, the NDP income tax cuts. So tax cuts are back. That is a good thing. But to address what we said earlier, the spending also has to go down. So new projects that aren't going to yield specific economic returns, things that aren't necessarily like infrastructure to develop new areas of the province or new industries, just things that are, programs that governments are the nice to haves, as John mentioned, those have to be reassessed. So I think that is, if we are going to continue to grow, then we have to also buckle our belts and restrain some of the growth in spending so that we can make sure that we don't leave it also as a burden for our children.
I think some people who've tuned in today may be disappointed that we weren't getting into the specifics of the different leaders and even recommending who people should vote for, which is something that I've never done on my show or anywhere else. I never endorse. I'm not a member of a party. Don't donate. I think that our province will be in good hands if any of the major party leaders is the premier when we wake up on the 3rd of June. And that's, the downside of that is that I don't think there's enough light between the parties, and I would like to see more fiscal conservatism in the province. But the upside is I am an evangelist for this province. I moved here 20 years ago. I love it here. I look around me, and in spite of all its deficits and the ridiculous slow growth when it comes to things like public transit and the deficits at government level and all of that stuff, I just see this as a great place to live, as a great place to work, as a place that people want to stay in. And people will argue, oh, high taxation is going to drive people out. Well, clearly, no. People like raising their families here. They like their kids going to the schools here. They like knowing that one of the best cancer hospitals in the world is in the province of Ontario. So I'm bullish on Ontario, and I'm bullish on the next year, and I think it's still a great place to grow.
Bullish on Ontario. That's a great way to wrap things up. Tasha Kheiriddin, John Moore, thank you so much for your time today and for keeping this debate very civil, but still impassioned with your very informed opinions. I think some of our other political leaders could learn from you. And also thank you to our audience for joining us today and for the questions. There were some great ones in there, and I only wish we had more time to get to them all. So wishing everyone a wonderful afternoon, and remember to vote next Thursday, June 2nd.
Vote. Thank you.